Okay, hello everyone. This is again Maryann Clesceri. I work for the Aurora Healing and Advocacy Services Department, and we serve adult men and women of all genders really to go through the trauma from the immediately after being sexually assaulted through their lifelong healing journey, and we provide those services. So that's uh, where I work right now, and I have been here for 13 years. So we're going to move ahead here. So we're going to be talking a lot about trauma and sexual trauma, and something I always say for my presentations is please remember, take care of yourself. I can't see you, obviously, but we know that there are probably survivors in the audience just based on the numbers, and that sometimes these things can be difficult to hear about or learn about. So just pay attention to your emotions. If you're feeling overwhelmed, I encourage you to step out of the room that you're at, or even if you need to turn me off, I would understand. And if you are having a quite a large reaction, get some support. You can go to your supervisor, go to a professional, go to friends, family, but seek that support should you need it. So, first of all, I'd like to talk about and define what sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse is. Oftentimes, when I'm talking about sexual abuse, that is most often talking about childhood trauma. Sexual assault we tend to use for adults who have been sexually assaulted, and then sexual violence is a general term that we use overall. Um, and we'll be talking about trauma, and that is a life-changing occurrence that leaves the victim feeling powerless, overwhelmed, and it gives them a sense of maybe loss of control, and that they kind of start to wonder about their connection and meaning between this trauma. We're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a disorder with some defining characteristics that occur following a traumatic experience. It can include nightmares, anxiety, hypervigilance, uh, and a combination of these behaviors leads someone, and if it has occurred over 6 months, then it is something that they now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex PTSD is something that usually when this trauma occurs in childhood, and due to the developing brain and where they're at, it is uh, what we call complex because the impact of those PTSD symptoms are greater. And then just, of course, AODA, I'm sure everyone knows that one, alcohol and other drug abuse addiction. And so I am ready for poll question number 1.
All right. So if you've never attended before, we're going to launch a poll, and what you'll want to do is give me one second. It should pop up any minute. Oh, hang on. There we go. You're just going to click right on the response to the question. The question is, what is the percentage of how many girls will be sexually assaulted before the age of 18? And choose the response that you feel is most accurate. All right, about 10 more seconds. So if you'd like to respond, please do so. All right. And it looks like our response was 25%, I'm sorry, 52% of our attendees reported 25%, 27% of our attendees said 50%, and 21% said 60%.
Okay. So let me get to the next slide. Okay. So actually, it is 25%. And certainly those are those that report sexual assault. And of course, there are communities where those percentages are greater. Some of the vulnerable communities, perhaps that many of you work in, have reported greater numbers of sexual abuse. But what we do know is 1 in 4 girls before the age of 18 and 1 in 6 boys have been abused by the same um, by the age of 18. So this is something that if 25% of our population all had the flu at the same time, we'd all be pretty appalled. And but we have this very great number of people who have experienced something before the age of 18, so they were young adults or children, and they have experienced this trauma. And then also some other things that we know about people who have experienced abuse is that about 30% will later go on to abuse their own children, and unfortunately kind of continuing that intergenerational cycle of abuse. And then one thing that I think is critically important that people know that work with youth or young adults is that only 1 in 10 victims will tell their sexual abuse. So it's critically important that if you're working with anyone that has reported abuse, that you respond to that. My experience has been working with the adult population is when I'm talking to them about did they ever tell anybody what happened to them as a child, they all remember what happened to them, and they remember who they told, and they remember how they responded. They remember if they responded with negative messages towards them, like, what did you do to cause this? They remember if that person just never talked about it again. And they remember if they were blamed for the abuse. So it's really important that us as adults know that most times children will never tell, but that if they do tell, it's really important for us to respond. Okay, I'm ready for poll question number 2.
All right, so same process, everyone. Next question is, what is the percentage of children that have experienced physical and sexual abuse that will develop post-traumatic stress disorder? And it cut us off, so sorry about that. Go ahead and select your response. All right, about 10 more seconds, so choose your response, please. That was fast. Looks like everybody's done. All right, and it looks like 50% of our attendees responded 58%, 34% of our attendees said 76%, 11% of our attendees said 22%, and 5% of our attendees responded 13%.
So overall, we have a very smart audience in that you are correct. It is about 58% of the time that children who have experienced both of those abuses will have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'd like to add that that is usually complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The good news with that is that 42% of the time, children, if they have some resiliency, if they have people who believe them, trust them, get them the support they need, oftentimes will not develop PTSD, but unfortunately about 60% do. The other things just to remember when we're dealing with sexual abuse is that most often, 90% of the times, the children know the person who has victimized them, and that oftentimes this abuse has occurred in the family 68% of the time. And the important part about that is that if this child knows the perpetrator and if it's within the family, the unfortunate part is that oftentimes this person has had access to this child over a period of time, and that due to the grooming process that it's unlikely that it only happened once, but unfortunately that it probably happened many, many times. And so that's the difficulty when dealing with child sexual abuse is um, often that perpetrator has had a lot of access to the child. But the other side of this is that this isn't just something that happens within poor communities. This is something that happens at every socioeconomic level. It happens across many ethnic groups, most ethnic groups, and certainly within all religions, all levels of education, all the perpetrators come from, uh, I've had experience with priests, lawyers, doctors, uh, CEOs, very high level people who are able to commit sexual offenses, but also attain quite high level of employment and able to go to work every day. So it's an interesting part about it, and that perpetrators is a whole nother topic for you all. And that when we think about sexual abuse, we have to remember that the average age is only 9 years old. And so oftentimes if there's victim blaming, we talk about what was she wearing, why was she walking that way, where was she going, why wasn't she safe? Well, this is a person who's 9 years old, who's uh, the adults in that person's life are really the people who are to care for that person. So just something to keep in mind when you hear those kind of myths that are out there. And I am going to move on. The other types of abuse that have really risen in the last 20 years is the social media and exploitation. We know that children are talking to strangers, they're sexting, they're sharing pictures. As you see, 25% of teens have sent naked pictures, which is illegal. Um, and one study found that 43% of children with social media profiles have messaged strangers. So that's almost half by the age of 12. And it wouldn't surprise me if that number will continue to go up. The same study found that 25% of teens who receive a text, which is a text with sexual connotations, that they send that on to someone else. So it's not something that just kind of stays within that person and the person they're sending it to. And we've seen a lot of these in the media of videos and things that have gone, gone prolifically out into the social media world and has caused a great deal of distress for the victims or for the young teens and some of the really horrible consequences being suicide or self-harming behaviors. And the other thing is that we have to be aware when working with people and youth that there are so many different apps out there that some are there to just be social media, Snapchat, Instagram, Tumblr. Then there's all the apps about how to get to a party, how to send information out to large groups of people. There's apps that are out there that are anonymous, that you can send information and messages to somebody and they don't know where they've come from. And then, of course, there's Facebook and Twitter and Whisper. And frankly, this list is probably even old already. And then there's all the dating apps that are out there. So there's just so many different apps that can cause some real problems for people under the age of 18. And just something to be aware of because we used to have the message, well, have that computer in a public place where the family and parents could watch it. Well, the devices have gotten smaller. The youth carry them wherever they go. And for parents, it's just harder and harder to stay on top of these things. The other thing is that as a parent, if you are trying to stay on top of things, there are apps that are disguised as calculators, as all different kinds of things that you would think as a parent are quite normal. You wouldn't think a calculator has anything else, but if they put in a code, it takes them to a different site that perhaps you don't want your child at. So, the big thing about when we talk about sexual violence is that this is a trauma, and that the younger they are, the more they're not understanding the trauma, but that also it impacts just who we believe we are and how we look at the world, and it creates moments for survivors where they have a great deal of fear. We have survivors who are afraid to leave their home, certainly are very uncomfortable taking public transportation, uncomfortable going to doctor appointments, anywhere where they might have to, disrobe. And so it oftentimes, as professionals, we get frustrated with people who have some of these viewpoints, but we have to kind of step back and say, where did that come from, rather than what's wrong with them, and why can't they just get over it? So they have a different view of the world after this, and then oftentimes they look in the mirror and don't recognize themselves, or look and see someone they don't like or someone they don't recognize. The other thing about trauma response that is really important to understand is that this is something that doesn't only affect the emotional part of a person, that it really, as you can see by the photo, it impacts the entire part of your whole body. And that as someone who has experienced sexual violence, they have had a trauma response. And our bodies respond to trauma in the fight, flight, or freeze. And that is those, since man has been man, this has been there. And it is our way when we are in trouble to take care of ourselves. When you hear about someone who there's someone buried under a car and three people go and they lift a 2-ton car. Those are the kinds of things that our body has and our system has created to respond to very dangerous situations. But for children who have experienced ongoing sexual abuse, their body is always in this fight or flight response. And so, as you can see, they are their body oftentimes overreacts to some of the things that are happening. They may always feel the need to resist. They may live in a chronic state of feeling the need to run away. Or if it's truly a very chronic abuse, they are moving to the freeze category. And we know that freezing for some animals that are being uh, uh, chased after, that they freeze, and that sometimes that has worked. But people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse will go into a conatic, I'm using the wrong word, sorry, where they're frozen and they're unable to move. And that if you look at our system, that is truly just based on how our body works. And so it's not something that can always be controlled, because this is something about how our body was set up. And so oftentimes we do see people who struggle with many of the issues, which I will get to shortly in the next few slides. So the reactions to sexual trauma are: there is an emotional impact, a mental impact, so not feelings, but also thoughts of, of that's what I mean by mental. Behavioral, how they respond; physical, how they feel, in their body and spiritual, how the impact of how they relate to a god or whoever their spiritual being is, how they could let something like this happen to me, and it impacts their ability to see their faith. So some of the physical effects that we have seen for people, and in fact, with the ACE studies, adverse childhood experiences, what we find is those higher levels of adverse experiences, the higher degree of physical effects. We know there's the emotional and mental, but really the physical effects are great. And that takes you back to the previous slide where it really disrupts the way our bodies function. And when that continues to occur over time, that it can really affect the way your stomach works, your bowels work, your blood pressure. So oftentimes when you're in that state of anxiety, it does affect your eating patterns. People who have chronic nightmares or wake up often in the night or are afraid to go to sleep, and so try to stay up so because of the fear of those nightmares. People who I've had people try to overeat as a way to hide their body, to not look like a sexual being, and those who use their eating as a way to control because they've lost control in the act of the sexual violence. Chronic fatigue, which is often linked to lack of sleep, and then those gastrointestinal irritabilities. Those are huge because they're so linked to our body and how our systems work together. Chronic headaches, HIV or sexually transmitted diseases, and those come due to some of the mental and emotional issues that come. Oftentimes, when you've been sexually abused as a child, you may not understand the impact or respond to sexuality in a way as someone who has had a normal sexual development. And what I have found is that working with young women, that oftentimes they'd either be very sexually active or not sexually active at all. And then, of course, the more you're sexually active, the higher your chances of getting HIV, AIDS, or STIs. And so just some other, as a result of what I just talked about with the sexually transmitted diseases, which then can also lead to pregnancy, with those abused in childhood, teen pregnancy, and of course the physical effects of substance abuse. There is a lot of fibromyalgia or soreness, muscle-related issues, stress-related depression, and of course, because their immune system has been so compromised, then they have immune system issues. Some of the emotional effects that come is that oftentimes I think we think of victims of crime as we kind of may feel sorry or a lot of empathy for them, but a lot of people that I've worked with are really quite angry. The world hasn't been really fair to them, and anger is a real easy response to release versus how maybe you really feel. So anger is something that we see quite often. A lot of anxiety, fear of going places, a lot of behaviors around the anxiety, maybe short fingernails or biting the fingernails, pulling hair out, also handshaking, eyes dilated just from that chronic anxiety. Not denial, not recognizing that they have any of these issues, feeling numb because they don't feel emotions, because what if they were to feel the emotions, it would be too much for them. And so often have just kind of this overall numbness. not, and that could be in the body also, just not feeling when they have a neck ache or a backache or some of those issues that could lead to chronic physical issues, but really not feeling those as a way to dissociate what has happened to them. And dissociation is a common occurrence, especially for children, as a way to just not pay attention to what was happening. And it's a way to almost like an outer body experience. It does sound kind of woo-hoo, but it is something that has allowed people who have experienced a lot of trauma to not have to feel it. We also see a lot of depression, really great amounts of sadness. And then oftentimes, even though this happened as a child or a young adult or even an adult, people somehow feel that what did I do to cause this, especially if it happened in childhood and then again in adulthood. Just a profound embarrassment, shame, feeling it was their fault, even if they were only 6 years old when it happened. A lot of fear. I already talked about that. Helplessness, hopeless. Will I ever feel better? I don't know how I'll ever feel better. And then sometimes there's phobias of um, if it's something that relates to what happened to them. It could be a smell. The smell of alcohol is something that can bring on an emotional effect and then brings on almost a physical reaction when they smell that. We've seen people that it kind of crosses over into fears of being outside, being near certain animals. And it all kind of, there's some type of relationship back to what happened to them. And again, just the vulnerability shock and sense of sometimes of unreality. Again, some of the mental cognitive effects, and I related to some of these already. Am I damaged? People truly feeling dirty and taking 3 or 4 showers a day, um, but then also triggered when they're in the shower because it's all relating back to that abuse that happened. Um, and that feeling that this bad thing happened to me because I'm bad and other people are good and therefore I must be bad. And if you're a child, when you're having these thoughts, your brain hasn't really fully developed. And so there's a lot of confusion, or somehow I could have fought back. I've had 7-year-old boys say, I should have been able to fight that person off, and thinking about maybe adult person who was doing this to them, really not understanding that physically they couldn't have done that. And with the use of grooming, that really they couldn't have done that either. We see a lot of difficulty concentrating. We know that the brain has been impacted by trauma. They can see it on CT scans, that there are areas of the brain that function differently after trauma, and that leads to difficulty concentrating and what we have often called as looping. If you have been around people who have experienced trauma, they may go back over and over and over again to what happened to them. And often we think, oh, if they talk about it, they'll feel better. But often this is just an act of looping, and it doesn't get better. It just continues to be kind of this round circle that they just keep going in. We do have people that have flashbacks. Often uh, we find that that could be something where they're triggered. It could be the time of day. It could be the time of year. I mentioned before a smell, getting in the shower, getting in a car, all kinds of things that relate back to their abuse. So we do see a great deal of where they feel like they're right back in what happened to them and have a great deal of anxiety and body shaking and dissociation that occurs when those flashbacks occur. We also see people who uh, when you think that might be a flashback, but when they're trying to work on these issues, they have a great deal of anxiety, and that can come out in a seizure, the whole body trembling, and so flashbacks and triggers can really bring on a multitude of different things. People feel that they deserved it, if or I just need to get over it, I'll forget about it. And like I mentioned before, this is something that has impacted the way the brain has worked. And so it isn't as simple as once this has become a pattern for this person as I will just get over it. They really do have to work on things to get their brain, and the brain is able to repair itself. And so there are things that need to be done to kind of move them away out of that. And again, a lot of survivors feel rejected and blamed and have low self-esteem. Uh, and what we find for survivors is that they have had a behavioral impact. They oftentimes, because of maybe the difficulty concentrating, they have a difficulty getting things done, or because there's the opposite side of always wanting to get things done, so are constantly in a state of I need to clean, I need to straighten up, and wanting their life in order. And in order to get it in order, they will engage in constantly cleaning or feeling always dirty. And so again, taking multiple showers, almost getting into obsessive compulsive disorder looking behaviors, washing hands, doing things like that, not trusting themselves. So leaving the house, going back in, did I turn this off or did I take care of this? We do see a lot of difficulty with intimacy and maybe even having longtime partners, but really have maybe flashbacks or anxiety with moments of intimacy, or in the moments of intimacy dissociate and really don't feel what's happening and really aren't present for that moment. We have people who are uncomfortable around others. They are kind of isolate themselves. But then you also have people who are afraid of being alone. It's kind of like always these two dichotomies where it's either all or nothing. Often we see in survivors. They want to be around other people. They want to be alone. They have no sex. They engage in sex with multiple partners. So we really see a lot of the far ends of behaviors. Um, and then again, just some hypersensitivity when relating to others, and just a hard time socially based on what happened to them. And I think you can read the others. And so this is, I like this photo because it really talks about all the many things that occur when people have post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of the things I talked about and are in here. Just some other things to keep in mind. Of course, veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder, and of course, people who have experienced other types of abuse. But the way our body responds to trauma is often that way for multiple people who have experienced abuse. So the other thing that I haven't talked about a lot that you can see in this photo is that we do have a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, uh, especially alcohol abuse. Alcohol is something when you're feeling anxious, disconnected, that all of a sudden you can it reduces those feelings. It brings it down. We also get a number of survivors who are using marijuana. Marijuana helps them to sleep. It kind of calms the brain down, and oftentimes it becomes something that they need every day. And so we do see a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, and we've seen quite an increase in heroin use as also a way to address the PTSD. So, what can you do as professionals working with someone who you believe maybe experienced trauma or sexual trauma? And the most important thing you can do is, and you may have already probably heard about this, and I think it's out here a lot, is trauma informed care. What can we do about thinking about that person as not the person with all these issues and I can't figure out how to work with them, but really just having a different lens and saying, what happened to them? So so what can you do to create an environment, and you're working with someone that you think has experienced sexual trauma? It's really important in your relationship is that you create safety. Create a place where it's easy for them to walk out. You don't want to make them feel like they're locked in the room. You want to have trust. If you're saying you're going to do something for them, you do it. It's really important because that is something that the perpetrator probably did, or maybe other people in their life said they would do something and they didn't, or they lost the trust of someone. And so anything you do, they're looking at that. And you think, oh, come on, I forgot to do this for you. And they have that strong reaction. And sometimes you wonder why they're having that strong reaction. Well, a lot of it is because trust is so critically important to them. Help them develop a partnership that you're in this relationship together. So you give them choices, you give them options as you work on your relationship with each other. Allow them to have some empowerment and don't ignore the trauma history. I do ask that people not share a lot of their story because we don't want people to get upset, but just to say we know it's there and that I understand. Uh, think about how you position yourself in a room. That's much like allowing them to have a exit point, and then always ask for permission to touch or hug. Oftentimes, trauma victim, if you just happen to touch them on a shoulder or something, and they twitch, that's a sign that touch is not safe for that person. I always say stay at the eye level, don't look down to them, and then just always be present, be listening, pay attention to what they're going through. Um, and we want to also have healing environments where we are, so we want to ask what that means to them. What would make you feel better here? Believe that the person has that ability, and that goes with the trust. Um, and then, support them where you can, but let them know where you can't. So acknowledging that and make that commitment that you're going to be honest, you're going to follow through with what you're doing, and to keep that in that relationship with that person. The other piece is know yourself. Did you have trauma in your childhood? Did you have a parent that struggled with certain issues? And so it's really important that what the person you're working with is not, and what you experienced are not the same thing, and to keep those things separate, and to not assume that their triggers are your triggers, or and that you have your own work to do, and to understand that is part of working with others, is that understanding your own trauma. The critical important thing is not to look at that person as they have deficits, but look at what they have and have compassion for them. Think about how they are, they have gotten through this world by pushing people away because that was what helped them to feel safe. Always remember, whatever they did, it was a way to keep themselves safe. Rather than thinking about how bad their lives are or how many bad things there are, oftentimes it was always a reason behind that, and that was a way for them to cope. So I think that's where you can really turn someone's life around, is where you could help them stop thinking about themselves as having all these bad behaviors, but that you are recognizing that they just didn't understand the right way or the other ways to respond. Um, but don't excuse their behavior, but explain it. And so when they are yelling at you or they're upset with you, understand that this is a trauma survivor. When I work with people and I think this person is always got to be in charge, always is getting angry, I always have to back up and say, this is a trauma survivor and this is a trauma reaction, rather than, man, this person drives me crazy. So it's just helpful to think about it differently. And so, if someone does disclose to you, um, the things to say are not, get over it. Geez, that happened 20 years ago. Why is that still bothering you? Because it will still bother them if they have PTSD. Those things don't just go away. They have to work through them. But what's really important is for them to be believed, and to know that you truly believe that. And I'm sorry you were hurt in that way, even if it was a very long time ago. And if you are a child, you are not to blame for what happened to you. Other people made a choice to harm you, and that you, regardless of what kind of behavior that child had, it's not your fault. And you deserve help, and people need to help you with this. And would you like me to connect you with someone else? And it's what's critically important is when someone tells you what happened to them, they trusted you with that information. They're looking for you to believe them. And if you dismiss them or aren't listening, that just feeds into those records that play in their head. But when you take the time to say thank you, I, oftentimes that means so much. For someone like myself who has been doing this work for a long time, I've had many people who come up to me and tell me that they've been abused. And I know they have told very few people. And I know that my response is critically important. And I always try to give them a very empathic and listened response, because I know that this was a really important moment in their life that they chose to tell me. And I feel honored that they chose to tell me. So you always want to validate those feelings, have an understanding for what happened to them. Um, they oftentimes throughout their life have probably felt abandoned, blamed, used, and we don't want to repeat that behavior. We want to correct that behavior. And we have that opportunity to do that through our relationships with others and as we're working with trauma. Help them to see their strengths. They all have strengths. All of us have strengths, and they are unique and they're valuable. Often have a lot of creativity, use poetry or songwriting. Oftentimes they have their favorite song that has helped them get through difficult times, and so there's always something of value to find in someone. And when you look for those values, the greater the likelihood you're going to see those resiliencies. The other thing to remember, if you are working with a lot of people with trauma, and I think if we're working with people who have a lot of needs, as we do as social workers, I'm a social worker myself, um, we have to practice self-care. People give us a lot and they put a lot on our shoulders. And so it's really important that we take the time to recognize that people have laid their pain at us and that we have to do something with that pain. And if we then go home and yell at our husbands or, sleep all night or drink too much or lack friends, we are we are in the midst of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. We have to recognize that, oh, it's time for me to take a vacation. If you haven't taken a vacation in 6 months, you have to look and say, it's time for me to do that. If we're doing this work, and many of you are probably case managers and social workers, you have to take time for yourself. because you're in a helping profession. So identify your own coping strategies and what ways can you do to take care of yourself? And what ways can you appreciate yourself and have gratitude for yourself and give yourself that sense of meaning? You have a job that has meaning, but you also have to give yourself meaning and take care of yourself and practice those things, getting massages, taking walks, doing those things that you have found joy in your life, and acknowledge that you're going to have strengths and weaknesses, but that it's really important that when working with trauma or working with people who have special needs, that there's a lot of pain that comes to you, which then means you have to take care of yourself. So that concludes my presentation, and this leaves us about 10 minutes or so for questions, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maryann. If anyone has any questions or things they'd like to share, please type those into the chat box. We can get those to Maryann. We'll just kind of hang tight for a minute while you guys have a chance to type. I think they're going to be shy to. Oh, there we go. I thought they're going to be shy for a minute.
And I would understand that. It's a tough
It's
topic.
always hit or miss. Yep, we never know how many questions. All right. So, is it possible or necessary for a victim to forgive their abuser?
Very good question. And something we debate over here quite a bit. Um, I have had people who feel strongly because of their spirituality or their faith that forgiving their abuser is really important to their healing process. But I've had people who have had so much hate and resentment, and that hate has been such a burden on themselves that that it impacts their well-being. And so it's really not a yes or no answer because it's all over the place because it could be your brother, it could be your father, it could be your sister, people who you truly care about. And so and through therapy and through hopefully really good intervention, there are times where people can at least forgive. But oftentimes, because of those triggers and being around the person, it can be really difficult. And I always give people permission to not forgive them, but figure out a way to move on. Because if you kind of contain that anger over and over again, then it's that person still in some ways controlling you. And so I really encourage them to figure out a way to maybe not hate them, but to move on beyond them. I hope that answered it.
All right. Um, what do you advise for a client who was a victim of date rape as a teen, but is now middle-aged and never truly dealt with the assault?
I would say if this person is experienced teen dating violence and has some of those symptoms that I talked about, and therefore has perhaps some PTSD or some trauma responses, maybe not full blown PTSD, that they do get help, that they do, because what happens is that everyone tries to figure out a way to cope. And oftentimes, like I said, drugs and alcohol, maybe many sexual partners, depression, anger, difficulty sleeping, and so they need help with those. And over time, it's those coping strategies wear out and they're not as useful. And so what they need is they need some new tools and some new methods to address kind of how they're feeling all the time. So I do encourage people to get help, especially if they are experiencing some of the things that they talked about, or if they just want to kind of figure out and have still unanswered questions about what happened. Certainly, especially the organization I work for, because all of our services are free, they certainly could come here for that help. But we're in Milwaukee.
I would say, what's their area do you service? Is it
Yep,
just Milwaukee?
but we're in Milwaukee. But there are the 72 most counties in Wisconsin have a what we call sexual assault service provider, and they all have free services.
Yes, and there is it's like a Wisconsin sexual assault group. I cannot even think of the name, but if you Google it in Wisconsin, there it is.
So we have a coalition called the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and on their website, you will be able to see all the different programs in the state of Wisconsin. And there's lots of resources on that site that are very useful if you're working with someone who has experienced sexual assault, sexual violence.
And I would assume for those of you in other states, there's a good likelihood there's something similar. You could probably Google and find something in your state as well. And that was actually one of the questions, was resources. So you mentioned that site. Is there any other resources you would recommend individuals looking at regarding this kind of area?
Sure. Well, many states have either a coalition against sexual assault or against domestic violence, or, if you whatever state you're in, to kind of just Google that. Most likely, whoever your state coalition is will come up. And then there are the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has a lot of good resources. And then from their page, there's lots of good links to other resources too.
All right. Next question is, I have a client who suffered sexual abuse and when they were very little, and now has anger issues related to this that get to the point of screaming, throwing things, that kind of things. Any suggestions on how to help her or work with her so we can get her help?
So clearly, this is complex PTSD because it happened when she was extremely young, and she is in this pattern of utilizing anger, and it's what I call as some of that looping, that it just keeps going around and around with the anger, and it sounds like it's getting to the point, what I call, it's almost a window. And as survivors, especially complex PTSD, so the window is halfway open, and so that anger is kind of there. And over time, this window starts closing, and so the anger becomes greater and greater. So but the other side of this is that you can't force a survivor into services. Oftentimes, the legal system will work on that, and occasionally that works because overall, if they can find someone who understands them, it will. They may agree to it, but oftentimes they're going to fight it. But that to just demonstrate that by some of the things that I've said, and I probably have said during this presentation, is that this perpetrator is still winning. They're still controlling your life because they have your coping is anger, and it's all related to your trauma, and so they're impacting your life. And if you want that to change, take the power away from that perpetrator and bring it back to the person of who they want to be. I don't suggest you talk to them or try to give them these messages when they're angry. Just with the way the brain works, they're not going to be able to listen to you when they're angry. It's really not very helpful. You have to wait till they calm down and then work on I would just try to talk them into getting help. Like I said, you can't force people into it, but demonstrating that this is having an impact and that it's not uncommon for people 20, 30, 40 years later. We have a client who's 85 years old, And this happened to her when she was a child who's still working on it. So it's not uncommon. And just to let them know that it does have lifelong impact. I think that's it.
Oh, sorry. I cut you off. I thought you were done.
Yep, I was done.
Okay, good. What ideas or thoughts do you have or advice on working with a male victim who is disclosed, who might be even more unlikely to report or seek support or services?
Oh, good question. So we do work with men here too, and oftentimes men are less likely to report and feel even greater isolation because this isn't supposed to happen to men. And certainly, I have to say that this does happen to adult men. We have quite a few men who have come through that this happened to them. Often, unfortunately, maybe when they were using drugs or alcohol, but not always. Um, Young men are assaulted in college too. So there is a fear of reporting because they fear they won't be believed because this doesn't happen to men. Now, the other side of this is that unfortunately reporting isn't, I mean, if unless you really feel that this person wants to report, reporting sexual assault, the systems, the police, the court systems are not always very kind and don't always get justice. Um, and oftentimes people feel like, oh, if I could just get this person behind bars, that my life will be better. But based on everything that I shared today, you can see that trauma doesn't really work that way, is that when something else happens, suddenly your body goes back to the way it was. It just doesn't work that way. So I would just encourage him to seek help and maybe talk with an advocate to find out. And like I said, many counties and areas have sexual assault programs that have advocates that could help him decide whether he should report. And the further out it is, the more difficult it is to prove the case. And unfortunately, sexual assault is often done without witnesses. And so there's a lot of difficulties in trying and getting convictions in sexual assault cases. And unfortunately, many people who commit sexual assault go free.
All right. Well, and that brings us to 2 o'clock. So thank you, Maryann, for all of this information and sharing your experiences and just knowledge so that we can better serve those that are coming into our programs. And thank you to everyone who participated today. Don't forget to please complete the survey as it pops up as you're leaving. If it doesn't for some reason, it'll be in a follow-up email that comes through the system. I know sometimes it gets a little glitchy. And we will be back next month with our next presentation. So have a good week, everybody.